He was reasonable.
A reasonable expectation of beyond a reasonable doubt.
Very reasonable positions.
Are unreasonable.
One reasonable.
Is so fucking unreasonable.
Reasonable people. Reasonable.
Or reasonable things is a reasonable person. Here, completely unreasonable.
Reasonable. And reasonable discussion
Is reasonable.
A reasonable expectation of beyond a reasonable doubt.
A very reasonable question.
Reasonable.
Is for a reasonable
Mom and dad are unreasonable.
a reasonable expectation.
Reasonable.
To be reasonable. No reasonable person.
To be reasonable.
Unreasonable.
Reasonable people agree on.
Lindsey Graham is actually one of the more reasonable ones.
Reasonable.
Was a reasonable person.
No reasonable person.
Totally unreasonable.
Incredibly reasonable.
Really reasonable cop.
John Boehner is the reasonable one. Moderately reasonable Republican.
Unreasonable.
Ever reasonable.
Because cops are unreasonable.
Reasonable.
I think it's unreasonable to
Can't be unreasonable. More reasonably with
Reasonable legislation. Have a reasonable solution.
reasonable commentators.
Reasonable to expect
unreasonable search this.
beyond a reasonable doubt. There was a reasonable expectation of
Reasonable limits on. Be more reasonable.
reasonable.
Saying that a reasonable Congress.
Not an unreasonable comment.
Well, it's an unreasonable comment.
Pretty reasonable.
Reasonable.
A reasonable mistake. Reasonable settlements.
It's not just reasonable.
He's reasonable.
It's entirely reasonable. Reasonable.
Reasonable by
Most reasonable. Look, I'm trying to be reasonable.
He's a pretty reasonable guy.
Now, reasonable people
I think that it's unreasonable to be reasonable.
Totally unreasonable.
In a reasonable way. People are unreasonable. Like
Being reasonable.
But that's reasonable.
prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Being fairly reasonable when
Is the reasonable
reasonable. Okay,
I'm not
that's-
reasonable.
I think you're unreasonable.
I was reasonable.
More reasonable.
And we, I mean reasonable people.
Very
But it's reasonable to ask a very reasonable question.
Don't put that in the reasonable or unreasonable. Reasonable.
Very reasonable.
Can't get any more reasonable than that.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. Doesn't
I think women are a little more reasonable when it comes
Does seem reasonable.
There was one reasonable.
Reasonable. Reasonable Middle East.
I don't see any reason to doubt the reasonableness.
to reasonable at a time.
Which no reasonable. A reasonable one. This reasonable or rational advice. Reasonable.
You're not being reasonable. The most unreasonable.
Who stole Trump and put in a reasonable? Hell of a lot more reasonable.
Reasonable with
one reasonable argument.
Will be reasonable.
You need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
And many reasonable people.
No, they had more reasonable. Back to being reasonable.
And it seems reasonable.
That's reasonable. You
As a reasonable person would be reasonable. We're not unreasonable.
I think a reasonable person
Not a reasonable expectation of
A reasonable.
That's reasonable. Bush was the reasonable one.
A reasonable way.
Reasonable here.
There are reasonable people on
There should be reasonable limits on. He was actually a reasonable administrator.
reasonable people in the middle.
reasonable response.
Perfectly reasonable.
Reasonable interval of months.
Reasonable people think
Was reasonable.
Which seems reasonable.
reasonable expectation.
Should there be reasonable limits?
any reasonable person.
Very reasonable action here. Are really reasonable people.
Seems reasonable.
Incredibly reasonable.
Most of reasonable people.
Seems unreasonable.
Reasonable expectation of
More reasonable isn't reasonable.
Any reasonable administration. Not even reasonable.
That's a reasonable thing to say.
aren't reasonable. Always a reasonable number.
You're just unreasonable.
That seems reasonable.
at a reasonable expectation.
Every reasonable human being.
Reasonable and care about women. Do reasonable immigration reform.
Had moments of reasonableness.
Reasonable limits.
Reasonable Democrat. And